In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a grid-based image search application for Android. The image search will be using the networking capabilities of the Android phone and will be powered by the Google Image APIs. A few notes before we get started. In this video, I'm going to be showing you a step-by-step tutorial of how to build this application from scratch, explaining what I do along the way. I'm also not going to spend too much time focusing on polish, but in your own application, I encourage you to create a better user experience. First thing I want to show you is that you have access to a project slide deck. This deck, which is available on Canvas, has access to a comprehensive overview of all the projects we build in our course. So let's take a look at that now. You can see it here, weekly projects overview.pdf. This is the main title page for this project. Scroll down. First thing you're going to see for any project in this PDF is the scoping list. The scoping list will show you exactly what needs to happen from the user story perspective within the application. So the first thing I want to do is just read out the three major user stories in this application. First is that a user can enter a simple search query that will display a grid of images from the Google Image API and display it on screen. The second thing you ultimately will want to support in this application, but will not be shown in the screencast, is that you want the user to be able to modify the advanced search options and tweak and filter the results that they'll get back from the Google Image API. Final thing you want to support is that you want the user to be able to load more images. This can be done by adding a load more button. Now that we've looked through the stories, let's take a look at the concept we want to learn during this. So the image search requires a few basic concepts. First is it explores starting activities with intents, and we'll talk about that more soon. It will also explore how to load images asynchronously, and as well as how to send networking requests and get back JSON, parsing that JSON and then using that within your application. Now let's take a look at a mock-up of this application. You can see here the application's main screen is actually fairly straightforward. All it has is three major components. There's a basic label with app name, there's a search form, and there's an image result grid view. The way it will work is actually quite simple. A user will enter a query, they will hit the button, and then they will load the images from Google Image Search into the grid view here that you can see in the screenshot. That's all we're going to build today in this application. So let's get started. First thing, obviously, with any application you're going to build from scratch is you want to create a new project. So we're going to go into Eclipse, and we're going to say File, New, Android Application Project. The name of the project could really be anything, but we're going to call it Grid Image Search. Going to change the package name to reflect a more accurate namespace. I'm going to select the minimum required SDK. I'm going to select Android API 10. And now I'm going to hit Next. There's nothing we need to change on this window, so I'm going to hit Next. I'm actually going to upload my own icon here, and I'm going to select the image icon. But you do not need to do this. You can just use the standard Android icon. Now I'm going to select Next and choose a blank activity. And finally, I'm going to name this Search Activity. Now that I've completed going through the steps of the activity wizard, I'm now going to hit Finish. Once the application finishes generating, I'm going to show you how to start thinking about how to design and then implement this application. So let's start by doing what you always need to do when you start this application. Go ahead and run the emulator, and you'll see now that the emulator is going to boot up soon. Then we will have access to this emulator throughout the rest of this screencast. So the first thing that I typically do when I'm building applications is I think about which dependencies I'm going to need. And dependencies in this case are just libraries that I'm going to use to make my development of this easier. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to use three different libraries. I'm going to show you what those are. So the first library is the Android Smart Image View. This is a extension of the normal Android image view, which is how to display an image. And the minor addition is that it allows you to asynchronously load an image from a remote URL. This is important because the normal Android image view does not support this. So we need this library in order to asynchronously load the Google images that come from a URL. The second one that I'm going to talk about right now is the Android Async HTTP. This is a library that is focused on allowing us to do simple HTTP requests in an asynchronous way. In Android, the normal HTTP request library is synchronous, meaning that you would have to manually run it into a background thread or use something called an async task. In our case, we really want to make this as simple as possible for this project, so we're going to show you how to use the Android Async HTTP library. You can find more information about these libraries fairly simply. Simply go here and search for Async Android library, and you'll see that one of the first things that comes up is the Android asynchronous HTTP client here. Here's some documentation that shows you the basic usage of it, which we'll get into soon. And of course, you can also do the same thing for the Android Smart Image View. Here it is. So we will talk about how to use these soon. Moving on, you can notice the emulator is loaded and we are now ready to get started with our grid image search. We have the icon that we selected, the title, as well as the default Hello World text view. So the first thing we want to do now, as I said, is load the libraries I just mentioned into the folder. So let's go ahead and drag those in now. Just go ahead and find them, download them from the Canvas files section. So you can see it here. If you are on Canvas, you can just select files and you can download them from the libs folder. If you are not from Canvas, if you don't have access to it at this moment, then you can download them from the individual site as well. So once you've downloaded them, go ahead and drag them into the Eclipse workspace. You can see here that on the left-hand side, we now have the items loaded in the libs folder. The next step, now that we have these set up here, is we can begin thinking about how to create the layout for our application. So let's go into the graphical layout mode, because this is a great learning tool. And let's take a look at right now the default Hello World text view here, which you can see in the outline as well as on screen. We'll go ahead and delete that. Now we have a blank canvas for us to lay views onto. So first, we want to take the text field and go ahead and drag it onto the screen. Let's drag it on. Noticing the highlights on the top and left, we want the rules to say align parent left, align parent top. Once you see those and you see the green lines, release. Now you can see the text box that can be entered by users to enter the query. And the next thing we need is a button. So let's go in and find the Form Widgets category. Let's go ahead and drag a button on screen, this time aligned to the top right. Go ahead and release. So you can see now we have our button, and we have our text view. So now let's go ahead and enter new text for the button. So select the button and enter the text at the bottom here and go ahead and hit enter. You'll see now it says search, which means we now have our text, edit text, and we have our button. Let's go ahead and save. Let's go ahead and run this and see what it looks like. Okay, so you can see we have our edit text and our button. Nothing, of course, works yet, but at least it's on screen. The next thing we probably want to do is go ahead and add the image view, which is going to be what's called a grid view. A grid view is like a list view, but it displays the items in a table format. So you can go ahead and drag the grid view, and you want to select it on the left-hand side, and then you want it to say below button 1. So once it says line parent left true below button 1, go ahead and release, and you'll go ahead and see the grid view on screen. So at this point, we now have the edit text, the button, and the grid view. Let's go ahead and look at the XML here, and you can see the edit text, the button, and the grid view. You can see the rules here. Take a note of the rules. This aligns the view to the left side of the parent, slides to the top. The button is aligned to the right parent top, and the grid view is actually aligned to the parent left and then immediately below the button. You can also see the number of columns is specified here. So going back, the next thing we usually want to do is go ahead and rename the IDs of each of these items. So on the left-hand side, you can see the edit text. Let's go ahead and change that to ET query. For the button, let's call the button, set it with the ID button BTN search. And for the grid view, which is going to display our images, let's go ahead and call it GV results. So you've done that. Let's just do a couple other minor things. Let's go ahead and add a hint to the text box and call this enter search term. See it there in the text box as a placeholder. And the other thing we can do is I want to show you a warning you're going to notice here for the hint and the text. The warning says hard-coded string enter search term should use string resource. So the reason that you see that is because that these strings are actually hard-coded directly into this XML. It recommends here that instead you should be using the string resource. This is something you will see all the time in the Android universe. It wants you to use internationalized strings for all words across your application. I'm going to show you how to do that really quickly. So the way this works is you want to use what's called a string resource. Those live in the res folder and then inside of the values strings.xml. Let's go ahead and add one here for this hint. So I'm going to add a new string here in the strings.xml, and I'm going to call it query hint. Simple. And what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and just cut the value being the word you want to display in English. Here now what you can do is, rather than hard coding it, you can use something called the @string resource. And here now you have the option to select query hint. This is actually doing the same thing as hard coding it, except now it's referencing the value from here. You may wonder the value of this. The major value is actually twofold. One is it allows you to expand or contract the text on different devices, and the most obvious value is that it allows you to internationalize the text for various locales. So now that we've done that, you can see the warning has gone away. We can kind of move on here. So the next thing that we need to do is, since we've finished hooking up the XML layout, let's actually start hooking up the code. So the very first thing I typically do is I switch into the Java source code here, and that's going to be in the source folder and then inside of the search activity.java. Open that up and you can see here the standard stock activity generator. First thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and declare our fields at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and declare the three fields. We have the edit text, the grid view, and the button, with the appropriate names given based on the IDs. Two tricks here I want to show you off the bat. One is, notice these red lines. The easiest way to get rid of these is that the problem is that these are not currently imported into this file. The easiest way to import them is to hit Command-Shift-O. Once you've hit Command-Shift-O, notice it's added them at the top here, and now the red lines have gone away. So now that we've declared our fields for the views, we now need to actually find our views using findViewById. The way that I typically do this is I actually create a method called setUpViews. Let's go ahead and do that. And what setUpViews is going to do is it's going to actually go through each view that we've defined, and it's going to set the field variable to the handle using the method findViewById. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So you can see here, I've added 3 lines. Pretty straightforward, just casting and then finding the view by ID for each of these things. Past that point now, and anywhere in this application, we now have a handle to all the methods, and specifically to the views that were defined in the XML. So that's step one. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and attach the actual event listeners. What that means is we want to hook up the click handling that will allow us to search our application. So going back to our layout, notice this button is what we want to be able to click, right? When we click the button, it's going to show the items. So I'm going to switch to the XML actually. I'm going to find the button here in the XML layout, and I'm going to add the onClick property. The value of the onClick property for the button is the name of the method that you want to have run when that button is clicked. So let's go ahead and call this onImageSearch. What that means is that now when I click that button, it will look for an onImageSearch method in the search activity. So let's go ahead and define that next. So switching back to the search activity Java, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and implement a basic onImageSearch method. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we want to do is we want to, in this case, the first line is simply getting the query string from the edit text. And the second line is going to go ahead and use this toast concept, which is a basic way of displaying text on screen in a temporary dialog in Android. And we're going to use toast.makeText. We're going to pass the context, the body that we want to display, and then the duration that we want to display it. This can also be short. And then we're going to call it .show. So I'm going to go ahead and test this out in my emulator and verify that we can now see the result of clicking the button. So back in here, if I search for Android, and I hit search, we do indeed see the toast at the bottom, which is searching for Android, and then disappears. Great. So we now confirmed that the basic click handler is completed. The very next thing I want to show you guys is what we're going to do to actually get the images from Google. So let's go ahead and go back to the browser here. And let's take a look at the Google Image API. So you can see here the Google Image Search API is this V1 guide. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. So the simplest way to do this is to go into the Java example and show you the snippet here. So all you need to do in order to use this API is actually just send an HTTP request to this URL. So I'm going to actually go ahead and show you what that looks like in the browser. And I'm going to search for Android here. I'm going to clean up the URL a bit. And you can actually see here now the JSON that comes back. So you send an HTTP request out to Google. Google sends back a JSON response with a response data key, a results key, and then an array of image results with a variety of properties, everything from the width to the height to the URL to the title. So what we want to do now is, in the future when we build this application, in the next steps, we want to send out an HTTP request asynchronously, pull back this JSON, and then use that to display the images in the grid. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about a common pattern in Android. When you're building an Android application, you typically want to think about the models that you're going to be working with. A model is, in most cases, just a simple JSON or other object. It's a resource, and it's going to be translated into a Java object. In this case, our resource or our model is an image result. This model might be persisted, it might not. In our case right now it's not going to be, but in future examples we may build a SQLite database to persist these back to a database. In this case our models are going to be in memory, but we're still going to be creating a simple JSON object by sending out the API request, and then we are going to translate that to a Java object. So let's create the Java object now that will ultimately represent the JSON request. So I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call this class image result. So in image result, we want to describe which fields are going to be inside of this object, as well as how to parse the JSON and actually turn that JSON into this object. So let me show you how to do that. First, let's define our fields. In our case, for our purposes, we really only need 2 fields at the moment. If you notice, back going to here, you have the URL and you have the TB URL. TB is the thumbnail URL, and URL is the full URL. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify those privately. The next thing we want to do is we want to create, of course, getters for those. So let's go ahead and do that. And of course, we would be nice to have a toString method so that when we're debugging this, we can actually see the URL attached to this object. The final thing I want to show you right now is a constructor. The constructor for a model tends to be accepting a JSON object in this case, because if you're coming from a JSON API, you're going to get back a JSON object. And this object should be used to create the image result. So you can see here I've created a constructor for image result. I pass in the JSON object here, and that's going to be a dictionary of keys specified by whatever comes in from the request. So these keys are going to be the object's keys. Coming back here, I'm going to hit Command-Shift-O. I'm going to import the JSON object, and then I'm going to show you here, all I do is I run a try-catch, and then I do 2 lines. One line is actually to get the URL key from the dictionary, and the other one is to get the TB URL key. At this point now, my image result will have both URLs that it needs. You might imagine the image result might also have a title or any of the other attributes we want to store from the JSON response. Now that we've done that, we're actually more or less done for the time being with the image result. So the next thing I want to show you is I want to show you how we're actually going to load the images from the API. So let's go back to the search-activity.java. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to try querying the API, parsing the JSON, and then printing the URLs at least on screen in the logcat. So let's give this a shot here. Starting out, if we're going to store image URLs, we're going to probably need an array list. So let's go ahead and create an array list based on the model that we just created called image result. We paste that in, Command-Shift-O, and now we have an array list defined in our search activity, which is going to store a collection of image results. So now that we've defined that, let's go ahead and actually try and do a simple async HTTP request in order to get the results from the Google API. So in the onImage search, we're going to leave the toast in place. Beneath that, I'm going to show you how to use the async HTTP client. Now, as I mentioned before, we loaded the async HTTP client earlier, and the way it works is you simply create an async HTTP client. So let's start by that and show you how to use it. So once you've created an async HTTP client, you can access the internet by sending GET posts or deletes or puts through the client asynchronously and then managing the response using a handler. So I'm going to show you what that looks like next. So don't forget that the URL we want to hit looks something like this. This is how we get a response from Google. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just type client.get, and we're going to pass this basic URL. We'll walk through what that looks like right now. So first I say client.get, I pass the URL. I'm using a couple extra parameters here. RSZ is the size, the number that come back. The maximum you can get back in a single request is 8. The start value is the offset. So if you set 0, it will start from the beginning, but the way that you paginate is you change the start. You have to pass the 1.0 version here, and then you want to pass the query as being some query that we need to define, which we defined up here, coming from the edit text. And we need to encode that query in case there's spaces or any other characters that are illegal for HTTP. The next thing that you need is you need a handler to manage what happens once the HTTP response has completed. The way that you do this is you construct a handler using an anonymous class. So we're going to go ahead and just create the JSON HTTP handler here. And the interesting thing about the JSON HTTP handler is that it only really requires one method. It requires the onSuccess method. So what you're going to do is we're going to go ahead and paste in the onSuccess method and just take a look at it for a second here. So the way it works is you simply put whatever it is that you want to have happen inside of the onSuccess method. And so we're going to go ahead and do that now. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to get access to this response object, which, if you remember, looks like this. And we need to get the array of results, the meat inside here. So we're going to start by getting this big dictionary, and we need to break our way down into this array. So to do that, we need to go through the response data and the results. So the way that you do that is, first, we're going to just go ahead and declare the ultimate prize, which is we want a JSON array. And these JSON array is going to be the actual image JSON results. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and parse the response in order to get that array. So let's just go through this and discuss it really quick first. So what we want to do is go through and see the key here is we want the results array. So now that we've gotten that, you can see in this first line here, by going through the response data and then the results, the next thing we can do is we can clear the array that we defined up here before. So here's the array that it was defined before, and we can go ahead and clear that first so that we're starting fresh. And then we can add all the items from this array as image results. In order to do that, we actually need to call image result, and it's a common pattern to have the model parse the array for us. So you can see here we're calling image result dot from JSON array, which is not something we've created yet, but that will ultimately iterate through and parse each item into an image result. So let's go ahead and create that method. And you can see here that actually automatically generated it here for us. I'm going to make it public. And it's a static method so that we can access it directly from image result. Now we're going to change this from collection, we're going to make this array list. And the next thing is we want to now process the array and have it give us what we're hoping to get back. So essentially what we're going to do here, and let's just take a look, is we're going to iterate and aggregate the image result objects and then return them. Here to read, and we are going to iterate through, construct the image results array list, go through every item in the JSON array, which we're doing here, and then we're going to add that to the array list by constructing an image result and passing in the individual JSON objects that are inside the array, which will then be parsed by this constructor. Finally, what we're going to do is we are going to return those results back. So now if you go back to the search activity, you'll notice that we actually have everything working. And to recap, what we've done here is that we send out this AJAX request, we get back an object dictionary in the JSON object form, we created the array list of image result objects, and now we're iterating through and we added all of those to an array list called image results based on the data coming back from the API response. So the final line here that we've done is we actually log the image results to the console, which is down here. I'm going to do something really quick. Notice how I have a debug key here. I'm going to go ahead and add a debug filter name, and I'm going to filter by the tag debug. So now you can only see messages that have that tag. It's a good way of filtering out the noise from the log. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run the application. And if everything goes well, we should be able to type a query, enter the words, and then hit search, and then see the results coming back after the API call was completed. At this point, before we try to run it, let's go ahead and add a permission to our manifest. In Android, if you want to access the internet, you need to be able to enable the internet permission in the manifest. Let's go ahead and go to the XML and add this as the first line. Notice it's mentioning that we need the internet in order to use this application. Now that we've done that, go ahead and run this. If at any point you run this and you do not see any network activity, that usually means you have forgotten to add the network permission. So let's go ahead and type a query here, hit search. You can see here that the toast came in. On the bottom, you can actually see the array of URLs. So we have properly parsed and then instantiated image result objects that contain the URL. So this is good because that means that we have finished the hard part, which is often parsing and then constructing the Java models. And then, of course, the next step would be to display this in the grid. So let's take a look at how we would do that. So as you might be familiar with, in order to display anything in any sort of list or grid, the first step is you need to create an adapter. So let's go ahead and do that right now. An adapter is simply a way of mapping a particular data source, such as the image result array list, and turning it into a view that will then populate the list or grid view with items. So each item is essentially created from the adapter and inserted into the view. So let's go ahead and create a new class, and let's call this image result array adapter. We also want to subclass this, of course, have it be a subclass of the array adapter itself. And of course, we want it to be of type image results. So change that and hit finish. So now we have our image result array adapter. And the next step is we actually need to, here in order to make it valid. So step one is, you'll notice it says that it needs to implement a particular constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first. So we're going to create the constructor, which is actually fairly simple to do because the underlying constructor needs a few things. The underlying constructor requires a context, the XML that will be translated into an item, and the actual collection of items that you want to translate, so the source itself. Once you've done that, notice that my image result array adapter only requires a context and the images, because the resource, the text layout that we want to use for each item is going to be defined here. So once we've done the constructor, the next step is we need to see what happens if we just try it like this, because it'll be interesting to see what will happen with the result array adapter. Now you might notice that the type here is actually android.r.layout.simple_list_item1. This is actually a text view. A text view is just able to display a string. So the problem is that with a text view, the only thing it can display is words. It cannot display an image. But because any object can be had toString called on it, if we attempt to render by default, what will happen is the image result will have toString called on it. And if you remember, we've defined the toString method here, adapter, and actually make it do something. So we're going to add a new field, and the field is going to be of type image result array adapter. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to construct the adapter, passing in the context and the array of items that we want to display. And finally, we are going to attach the adapter to the grid view. So you can see here we call gridviewResults.setAdapter. We pass the image adapter inside. We also, here as I mentioned, attach the image result array adapter based on the collection of items that we had earlier parsed here to either notify the adapter, and I'll show you how to do that one first. You can call image adapter now dot notify. Pretty simple. The other thing you can do is actually use the adapter directly. So I'm going to actually change this to add all from the adapter rather than from the array. That will load the data both into the array and into the grid, as well as notify the adapter. So this is the easier way to do it, is to mutate your data directly through the adapter when possible. So let's go ahead and try this again now that we've properly notified the adapter. And hit search, and now, voila, we see these URLs in here. And of course, this is not our ideal view. We really want to see images, but what this shows you is that the URLs are actually being properly parsed. And now we just need to figure out how to translate these subviews, these items, into images. So in order to do that, what we need to do is actually change this. We need to go to the adapter, and we need to use something other than simple list item 1 inside of the adapter. Now to review here, we've now loaded it properly into the adapter. The problem is the adapter is responsible for translating the data into a view, and it does not know how to translate that properly. And it's partly because this simple list item 1 is simply a text view. It's just for text, not for an image. So what we want to do is we want to create our own XML file and then use that instead. So I'm going to show you how to do that next. Inside of the layout folder, inside of Res, we actually want to create our own file here, our own XML. Not an activity XML, keep in mind. This is an XML file, and it's similar to an activities XML. But this one is actually for the fragment, or the item, inside of the grid view. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to select the image view as the root. We're going to call this the item image result. Hit enter. So you'll notice it looks here quite a bit like an activity view, but don't get confused. This is the XML to describe a subview of the grid view. And so here you notice that we have the image view as the type. The problem with image view is that image view, the default version in Android, does not support an easy way to asynchronously load images. You can certainly do it. You can do it yourself, download the data, and load it in. But there's an excellent library called Smart Image View, which we loaded earlier, and this will actually do it for you. So I'm going to go ahead and use Smart Image View instead to simplify. Once you load in the Smart Image View here, notice I added a couple properties. I added the width of 75 dp. This is to control the size of the image in the grid view, and the height as well. And now instead of an image view, we have the Smart Image View, which is fully qualified here to be based on the version inside of the library we imported. So now that we've done that, let's actually go back to our adapter and actually use this in order to create the subviews inside of our grid. So the first step is, of course, as I showed you before, we want to change this to our own thing. So we want to get rid of this Android prefix. We're now going to use our own custom XML. And the second thing we need to do is we actually need to change the translation step between the data and the view. Because the translation step right now is going to try and take it and plug it in based on toString. So we need to write our own logic, which is going to fundamentally take the data and run a transformation which turns it into a view. This is done by overriding the getView method. So let's go and click the source option here. Let's click the override and implement methods and select getView. Now, as mentioned before, getView is the translator that takes a particular item and converts it into a view. In this case, we're going to take an image result object and turn it into a view. Now, right now it's just calling super, which again will do that toString. So we're going to go ahead and delete that. I'm going to explain these parameters here. The first parameter is the position of the item in the array, which allows you to get access to the underlying data. The second is an interesting thing. It's a way of managing memory. If a view has already been instantiated, you can take that view and recycle it, reuse it, in order to conserve memory. So let's say you have 100 items in a grid view. Rather than having 100 individual subviews, you might only have a handful that are going to be reused as you scroll through and automatically converted back and forth between different items. The final thing you have is parent, which is essentially just giving you access to the grid view itself. So once you've done that, we need to define this translation step. The first step in any translation is grabbing the original data. So we're going to go ahead and grab that data. So we now have the image info object, which has the image result data in it, which has the URLs. We also need to, we're going to have to grab access to our smart image view. So let's go ahead and create a field for that here. And then once we've done that, the next step is to actually get a handle to our smart image view by creating it from the XML that we defined before. I'm going to show you how to do that. The first step is in this pattern is usually to check the convert view. Again, convert view is an existing view, which we are now going to translate if it already exists. So if Android has already instantiated a view that we want to reuse, we simply use the convert view. If there is not a convert view, then we can create our view new, and then next time that view might be reused as a convert view. So in the case that there is no convert view, this means that this is one of the first times we've instantiated a subitem. We have to create a new version of the subitem. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take the XML file, item image result, which represents the description of our item, and we're going to inflate, which means we're going to take that file and we're going to instantiate it as a Java object. We're going to do that using the layout inflator. So the layout inflator is a component of the Android framework, which will take an arbitrary file and convert it into an in-memory object view. So the way that you do that is you simply take the IV image, which we've set up before, and you can inflate from the layout inflator by pointing it to an XML file and then casting the result of the inflation to the appropriate type. So you can see here I've now said IV image is equal to smart image view, and I've called inflate, passing in the item image result, the parent for the grid, as well as a Boolean, which is set to false. So now we've actually we've instantiated a subitem. In the other case, it's actually even easier. In the case of the existing image view, all we have to do is simply convert the view to a smart image view and then clear out any data that was already there. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're actually going to clear the data by setting the image to just a blank background. So this will clear the existing image, because again, this is reusing a subview that was already instantiated before for a different image. So I'm going to clear that image, blank it out, and then now I have access to this IV image, which is going to recycle the view to retain the memory. Final step, of course, is to actually take this view and to load the URL from the image result. So to do that, all we have to do is simply call the method from the Smart Image View library called setImageURL. And then we're going to use a method that we defined in image info, which is called getThumbURL, which gives you the smaller version of the image. So this is going to take the image view, and then we're going to set the URL. Finally, we're going to return the image view. So, this might seem like a lot of code, but conceptually, it's fairly simple. We're converting from a data source, in this case, an image result Java object, and we're translating it into a view. If there's already a view to reuse, we take that and we use that view. If there's not, we instantiate the view based on the XML file. Finally, we set the image URL, which is going to asynchronously load that URL's image into the image view. And then we're going to return the image view from this method, which will ultimately populate the grid view because that's how the adapter works. So now that we've done that, let's actually go ahead and see what happens if we run this. No changes are actually needed in the activity because the adapter remains the same except for the translation step, which is different. So now let's go ahead and see what happens here when we run the emulator. Let's hit search. You can actually see we've now populated the items into the grid view using the translation step that we specified in the adapter. So that is actually, by and large, the main task we set out to do. Be able to type, hit search, load from the JSON, and load it into the grid view using the image adapter. The final thing I want to show you before we sign off here is I want to show you how to see the image full screen by clicking. So right now if you click, nothing happens, but I'd like it to show you the full image view. The second thing I want to do is I want to show you what's next. What's the assignment that you want to do after you've completed this basic version of the grid image search. So let's start with the image full screen. So the first step to that is let's go ahead and create a new activity. When we click this, we actually want to bring up a brand new activity that shows the full image. So let's go ahead and do File, New, and then you can actually select Other here, open up Android and find Android Activity. Hit Next, and we want to call this activity the Image Display Activity. That's all we need to do. Hit Next. This all looks good, and go ahead and hit Finish. So now we have our new activity, the activity image display.xml, the image display, which will just show a single image large. So in order to do that, it's actually fairly simple. What we're going to do is we're going to delete the text view here, because this is useless to us, and we're going to load another smart image view. This smart image view is, of course, going to display the full screen image now, rather than the shorter image. And you can see here I gave this smart image view the ID IV result. I set up a max width of 600 dp. This is to keep the images at a manageable width. They'll automatically be shown with the proper proportions. And then I've aligned the image view with the parent left and parent top. And I've set the source, the current source of it, to just a kind of a transparent background. If you go back to the graphical layout, you'll see it's essentially invisible, but if you click, you can see that it exists here in the preview. And so once we've defined this, we've set the background, we've set the width, we now have our activity, which is actually fairly simple. It's just a single smart image view. And now we just want to hook up kind of the meat and potatoes, which is the actual steps of clicking the item. So I'm going to be able to click this, have that fire an event, which brings up the new full screen image in a different activity. So the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to go back to the search activity. I'm going to go to the top here, and we're going to use another handler. So if you remember, you can set up handlers on objects by simply using the set listeners, which exist inside of each view. So we're going to go ahead and use that, which looks a little bit like this. And so it's just gv.setOnItemClickListener. And then you want to instantiate new onItemClickListener, another anonymous class. If you hit Command-Shift-O, you'll notice that you still have an error, but it's been imported, but there's an unimplemented method. So the unimplemented method is called onItemClick. So we want to go ahead and, in your case, you want to hover over it, and you want to select Add that method. Once you've done that, you can now see that you have your listeners happy. You have the adapter, which is the list itself. You have the position, and you have the row ID. In this case, all we need is the position. So thinking about it, really all we want to do here is we want to now we're going to bring up a window, right, when we click here. So we created this listener, we've created an anonymous class, we have this event onItemClick, and when you click here, we want to bring up the activity. The way that you do that is using something called an intent. An intent is simply a request to bring up a new activity. So this is the basics of an intent. And the way that an intent works is you simply declare that which you want to do, you fire the intent, and then the activity or other task will be executed. In our case, we want to create an intent with two basic parameters. The first is the context for this activity, so the place that we're starting at. And you can do that by calling getApplicationContext. That's kind of a thing that you'll often see there as the first parameter. The second thing is the thing that we want to open up. In this case, we're going to pass it the class of the activity. So notice that our activity is called ImageDisplayActivity. So we want to go ahead and run the ImageDisplayActivity and pass it in by passing in the class here. So you can see now I've created an intent, which is a request to do something. And what I want to do is bring up the display activity. Now, of course, when I bring it up, I need to give it the photo that I want to display. So let's go ahead and do that next. How do we get the photo? We simply instantiate image result. And how do we get the individual data? We can call the data from the actual array list itself, call .get, and pass the position. So the position is, of course, coming in as part of the click, so we know which item. We now have access to the image result data, which we now want to put into the intent. And that's using something called a bundle. A bundle is essentially a parameter passed along with the request that you can access on both sides. So once you've brought up the new activity, the activity can access the bundle parameter in order to get data from the underlying activity that opened it. So we're going to go ahead and just put in a string extra. So it's called putExtra. You give it any arbitrary key name. This is like a parameter name in HTTP. And then you can give it any arbitrary value. In this case, the key is going to be called URL, and the value is going to be ImageResult.getFullURL because we want to display the large version. So now that we've done that, we actually have our intent, which is going to open up the correct activity, and we've passed the appropriate parameter, which is the URL that we want to display. At this point, in order to execute an activity that brings up an intent that brings up an activity, we call the startActivity method, and we pass the intent. This will fire the intent, passing the extras, the parameters that we've passed in. So at this point now, we're actually done here, and now we need to switch over to the intent that's going to be called. So if we open up the image display activity, see this is a blank, kind of generated activity. This is the activity that has the image view. And we now want to go ahead and take the parameter and use that parameter that was passed in the bundle from the intent. So the intent has the parameter encoded. We're going to decode the parameter and use that to display the image. So the first step is we want to get access to that URL that we just passed in. So once you've created an activity, you can get access to the intent that launched it by using the getIntent method. This method actually has a convenient helper called getStringExtra, and you can give it the key that you want to get from the intent. So you can see here we've now gotten the URL by accessing the intent and then getting the parameter that was encoded. So you can kind of see the back and forth here. You have the search activity, which adds the intent parameter, the extra here, and then you execute the intent, which brings up this activity. You can access the intent, get the string, and now use that here. The next step that we want to do is we want to get access to the smart image view that we instantiated in the XML. If you recall, for the activity image display, we have a nice large max with 600 dp smart image view here. And so we're going to go ahead and access that by using findViewById, like we always do. And so now we have a handle to that. And the final step here is fairly simple. We're going to take the smart image view and we are going to set the image URL of the smart image view based on the URL that came from the bundle. And we're going to asynchronously load that using the smart image view and load it in for the full screen. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So we're here, you can type Android here, hit search. So here they come up, and then click an item. So you can see here we have the full version. And hit back and select another item. And there we go. We now have the two intents. We have the main intent, which we are using, and we now have the image display activity, which is bringing up the image when we click from the search activity. So that was most of the goals. One extra little bonus I want to throw into this video is right now we're kind of cheating in a way because we're passing the string from the image result. But what if instead of passing the string, just the URL here, what if I wanted to pass the image result itself? Well, let's go ahead and try that here. So let's say I got rid of the get full URL inside of the search activity when I'm launching the intent. Let's go ahead and put the image result as a key. So if we try to do that, you're going to notice there's an error, and the error says the put extra is the intent is not applicable for the image result type. This is because by default in Java, the way that bundles work and parameters work is that you can only encode simple values. So values that can be stored to disk, strings, integers, longs. Nothing that's a kind of a complex Java object. If you want to encode and pass a complex Java object, you need to make that object in some way serializable and deserializable. The way that I'm going to show you is using the serializable interface. There's also another interface called the parcelable interface, which is created by Android in order to make a faster serialization process. But for our purposes, we're going to use the serializable interface because it's simpler. So I'm going to show you how to make an image result serializable. It's actually quite easy. If we want to be able to pass an image result into this bundle, we simply go into image result and we add the words implements serializable. Let me go ahead and import it. And you're going to notice a warning here. And go ahead and just generate the serial version ID. And there we are. We have a ID for the serializable object. We've implemented serializable, and now image result can be encoded and decoded in a way that allows us to pass it as an object into the intent. So now we can actually create this intent and pass the entire image result along with it onto the other side. So of course now we have to adjust on the other side here. Rather than getting a string extra, we're actually going to get an image result, which was passed from the other side. So I'm going to call get intent, and instead of calling string extra, we're going to call get serializable extra. And the key now, of course, is not URL, but it's result. So just to recap there, what we've done here is we went to, on one side, we created the intent, we passed the type of activity we want to launch, we then get the item that we clicked and pass it through, which is possible because the image result is now serializable. On this end, we now are going to fetch the intent and then get the result parameter from the intent in order to get access to that image result on this activity. Notice that there's an error here, and the reason is because we need to cast to image result instead of just using the base serializable object. Now the serializable object is going to be casted to image result, and we now have access to our Java object again. So the final change is, of course, to go here and change URL to get full URL, and now we have access to the full object. You might ask why we did this. Well, consider if you wanted to have a title or other information coming in from the image result. The best way to do that right now is to simply serialize the object overall. Or you could pass those as primitive values. You could pass the width, and you could pass the title, and you could pass the URL separately. The best way is actually just simply to persist the image result into SQLite and then pass the foreign key or the ID of the result, and then access the result on the other side based on the ID. This is more similar to the way it works on the web. But for our purposes right now, serializing the object and passing it through is probably the best way to get access to all the metadata of an image. So once we've done that, let's go ahead and run it. Let's go ahead and run this and see if it still works. So if we search for Android again and click an item, you can see that we are still able to load through using the serializable method. So now that we've done that, we actually have completed our grid image search. To review, we've built a networking-based application using the Google Image API. We have parsed the JSON. We've used a Java object to store the image result data coming in from the JSON. We've used a grid view to display the images. We've used an async HTTP client down here to asynchronously load the API data. And then we've, of course, loaded the data using a custom adapter that we wrote called image result array adapter by overriding the get view in order to translate the data to a smart image view. And of course, we use the smart image view to load that URL data into the image and display it. And having done that, we've actually have a fully functional grid image search. Now, there's a few things we've not done here. One is we have not added pagination. There is no way right now, as you might notice, to get more than 8 items. Really, I'd want to have, endless pagination here, or a load more button, or some way to easily get access to a wide barrage of images rather than just 8. So that's one thing we'd want to add. And one thing I want to point out here is you should check out something called Smoothie on GitHub. So if you search Smoothie GitHub, you will see that there is something called Smoothie. And this is a great way of asynchronously paginating on a grid view or a list view. So you might want to check this out, the Smoothie app, the Smoothie library. In addition to that, we also want to properly allow for filters, meaning that we want to allow the user to select the image size, the color types, the image type, as well as even a site restriction filter. And this is going to come up in a separate intent, which is going to load, allow the user to type the filters. You're going to hit save, pass that data back in a bundle, and then use that to change the parameters that are passed to the URL here. And you can look at the docs for the Google Image API to figure out how to restrict based on those parameters. So that's it. If you have any questions, let us know. And we look forward to you checking out our other projects in the future. Thanks.